Welcome to the story about one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in the United States. Before the original account began, listeners were encouraged to share where they were watching from and the exact moment they pressed play, just to see how far these stories traveled and when people found them. In the fall of 1837, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans was filled with some of the city's wealthiest men. An auction was taking place. And even for a city known for its large slave market, the crowd's excitement was unusually intense. What drew their attention was not the size of the sale, but one woman who soon became known across New Orleans as the Pearl, a name that stayed alive in the French Quarter for decades. She was described as about 5'4", with light cream-colored skin, soft brown undertones, deep amber eyes, and long dark hair that reached down her back. The auctioneer, Thomas Williams, introduced her only as lot number 17, but everyone in the room sensed something unusual. Rumors and quiet comments moved through the crowd as the bidding began at a price far higher than that of a typical household servant. What happened next became one of the strangest stories in the city's history, a place already known for its complicated social structure and harsh reality around slavery. This case would link powerful families, reveal old secrets, and lead to a chain of disappearances that stayed unsolved until 1962, when workers restoring an old mansion on Royal Street found a hidden room holding a journal, 3 finger bones, and a portrait of a woman whose striking beauty still showed through the fading paint. This is the story of Ella Lanina Reynolds, known to many as a Pearl, and the truth behind her disappearance in the winter of 1842. The auction from that night in 1837 was witnessed by several people, including a northern businessman named James Thornton, who wrote about it in his diary. When his journal was found years later, his entry showed clear discomfort. He wrote that he had never seen such excitement from men of influence, and that their behavior seemed driven by something more than the usual motives of the trade. He sensed that buying this woman meant something deeper to the bidders. At the time, Thornton knew nothing about her background. Ella Lanina had not been born enslaved, and she had not come through the usual channels of the slave trade. Ship logs from New Orleans showed she had arrived only 3 weeks earlier on a vessel called the Augusta. She was listed as a passenger, traveling with a merchant named Marcus Bennett. But when the ship reached the port, Bennett had died from an illness he had caught on the trip. With no legal papers showing her free status, authorities took Ella Lanina into custody and placed her up for auction. This part of her story was publicly known. What no one understood until much later was why a woman with clear education and refinement had been placed in such a situation, and why certain families seemed determined to keep her in New Orleans. To understand what happened that winter, it helps to look at the New Orleans of 1837. The city was a mix of cultures, wealth, and strict social categories. After the Louisiana Purchase, it had grown into a major port where fortunes were made from cotton, sugar, and the sale of enslaved people. Unlike most of the South, New Orleans had a 3-layer social system based on race. Between white residents and enslaved black residents was a large group of free people of color, many of whom owned businesses, land, and sometimes even slaves. It was a place full of contradictions. Slave markets operated close to theaters, and while strict laws limited the lives of enslaved people, social events for free women of color and white men took place regularly. Appearance and ancestry were extremely important, and a single ancestor could determine a person's entire future. The winning bid for Ella Lanina came from Charles Delacroix, a wealthy sugar planter whose family had lived in Louisiana since early French rule. He paid $7,000 for her, a huge amount at the time, especially for someone who had no experience with household or field labor. The notary who handled the paperwork noted something strange. Delacroix asked that the sale describe Ella Lanina not as a slave, but as a ward who would live in his home on Royal Street. What happened once she arrived at the Delacroix home remains unclear. Years later, members of the household staff said she was treated more like an honored guest than a servant. She had her own room, fine clothing, and access to the family areas. Visitors were told she was a distant cousin from France who did not speak much English, but she was never seen outside the house. According to family records, Delacroix's wife, Isabel, left for her parent home just 2 weeks after Ella Lanina arrived and stayed away for nearly half a year. During this time, Charles Delacroix stopped receiving visitors and handled all business through letters carried by his assistant. In January of 1838, He called Dr. Samuel Lawrence to the house to see Ella Lenina, who had developed a persistent cough. In his notes, the doctor wrote that she showed signs of illness, but he was more concerned by her emotional distress. When the two were briefly alone, Ella Lenina asked him if he knew anything about her real situation before she reached New Orleans. She was unable to explain further because Delacqua returned to the room. The doctor never saw her again. By early spring, stories began spreading through the city about the woman staying in the Delacqua home. Some said she was his daughter. Others said she was a companion brought from overseas. The most common rumor, though, was that she was somehow connected to the Villers family, a wealthy and private lineage whose head, Henri Villers, had been one of the strongest bidders at the auction. The Villers family had gained great wealth through sugar plantations and, according to local stories, through privateering during the War of 1812. By the 1830s, they kept to themselves and rarely appeared in public. Why they might be linked to a young woman recently arrived from Havana remained unknown for more than a century. Clues finally came when the hidden journal was found in 1962. Written in a careful hand, it began in February 1838. At first, the entries were simple, mentioning the weather and daily routines. But soon the tone changed. In March, she wrote that she had been allowed to use the family library but was still restricted to the inner courtyard. When she asked why, she was told it was for her own safety, though no details were given. She began to suspect that the explanation about her papers was not true. In April, she wrote about an elderly man named Villers who visited the house. He examined her closely, and he and Delacqua spoke in French about her resemblance and her family line, thinking she could not understand. When she questioned Delacqua later, he became upset and reminded her that without proper documents, she was legally in his custody. As her fear grew, she decided to try to escape. In July, she wrote that she had reached out to a housemaid for help sending a message to the American consul, hoping to confirm her birth record in Philadelphia. But her plan failed. The maid informed Delacqua, and Ella Lenina learned she would be moved the next day. Her journal paused until early September, when she wrote again from Bow Refuge, the Delacqua plantation, about 50 miles from the city. She was kept in the old overseer's house, separate from everyone else. A woman named Martha looked after her, but also reported her actions to the manager. Delacqua visited only once to warn her that if she tried to reach outside help again, he would classify her as a field worker. At Bow Refuge, her story connected with Joseph Miller, an abolitionist in the North who had entered Louisiana pretending to be a doctor. In coded letters later decoded and published, he wrote about a woman held on the plantation who said she had been born free in Philadelphia to a free mother. Miller managed to speak with her briefly and noted that she believed her situation was tied to a matter involving inheritance and identity that affected powerful people in the region. She begged him to contact officials in Philadelphia who might have records proving her status. Before he could follow up, Miller was discovered and forced to flee Louisiana. There is no sign he was ever able to help her again. Back at Bow Refuge, Ella Lenina continued writing less and less through late 1838 and early 1839. Her entries describe what she saw on the plantation, her attempts to gain help, and her growing belief that her confinement served a purpose beyond simple control. In December 1838, Ella Lenina wrote that she overheard the plantation manager talking with a visitor about the Villers' inheritance and problems with confirming certain details. As soon as they noticed she was nearby, they stopped speaking and walked off in different directions. Later, when she asked Martha if she knew anything about the Villers family, the woman turned pale and refused to discuss it. She only warned that the Villers were people one should never cross. Ella Lenina wondered what possible connection she could have to them. The mystery deepened in February 1839, when she received an unexpected visit from Henri Villers himself. Now elderly, he arrived at Bow Refuge without informing Charles Delacqua. On February 26, 1839, she wrote that the old man came alone and asked Martha to leave them. He questioned her about her mother, and specifically asked if she had once owned a gold locket with a ship engraved on it. When Ella Lenina said yes, he reacted as though something important had just been confirmed. He then asked what she knew about her father's death. She repeated what her mother had always told her, that her father was a French merchant who died at sea before she was born. At that, the old man made a small sound that she could not read, something between a laugh and a sigh. He told her mother had been careful, maybe too careful, and then left. He said he would return, though she was unsure whether to hope for it. Henri never came back. 3 days later, he was found dead in his study, apparently from natural causes. His death triggered a complicated legal battle over the Villers estate, since he had no son. His closest relative, his nephew Louis Villers, quickly moved to claim the inheritance. During this dispute, Ella Lenina's journal began hinting more directly at a link between her and the Villers family. In April 1839, she wrote that Charles Delacroix arrived upset and demanded to know every detail of her talk with Henri Villers. When she told him what had been said, he pressed her repeatedly about whether Henri had mentioned any documents or handed her mother any papers. She told him he had not. Delacroix then searched her room and took her mother's Bible, which held her letters and her birth certificate. She wrote that she feared she had lost the only proof of her identity. Her later entries show that she had begun to understand the truth. In June 1839, she wrote that she now believed she had been taken not because of her price on the auction block, but because someone wanted to stop her from claiming something that might legally belong to her. Her mother had once said her father's family had refused to acknowledge her, but had never explained why. If her father had been a member of the Villers family, possibly even Henry's son, and if documents existed proving this, it would explain why Delacroix was so determined to keep her hidden. This idea matched an old rumor in New Orleans that Henri Villers had a son, Jean-Baptiste, who had formed a relationship with a free woman of color in Philadelphia around the early 1800s. Some said he had secretly married her before he died at sea in 1817, the year Ella Lenina was born. If she was his daughter, and if the marriage could be proven, she would have had a real claim to the Villers estate under Louisiana's legal system, which still reflected older French inheritance rules. A claim like that would have caused an uproar, since it would mean recognizing a woman of mixed ancestry as the rightful heir to one of the most well-known white family fortunes in the state. Her last dated journal entry was from September 3rd, 1839. She wrote that she had found a way out. A riverboat would stop the next day to load sugar, and Martha had agreed to help her in exchange for a pair of pearl earrings her mother had left her. She planned to reach New Orleans by nightfall, and then head north in search of the papers that could prove her identity. The journal ends there. What happened next had to be pieced together from other sources. Plantation records from Bow Refuge note that a woman matching her description went missing on September 4th, 1839. A reward was offered, and most of the search focused on boats heading toward free states. But evidence suggests she went back to New Orleans instead, likely to find her mother's documents in the Delacroix home before attempting to escape the region. A receipt from a French quarter shop dated September 7th. 1839 shows purchases of women's items charged to Marie Laveau, the well-known spiritual leader who was rumored to shelter people in hiding. After that, Ella Lenina disappeared from all records for nearly 3 years. The Villers inheritance case continued without her. Louis Villers was confirmed as the rightful heir in 1841. Delacroix, who had searched intensely for her at first, seemed to give up the pursuit and turn his attention to financial troubles affecting his sugar operations. Then, in January 1842, Ella Lenina returned to New Orleans in a dramatic way. She appeared at the annual Mardi Gras ball at the St. Louis Hotel, the very place where she had been sold years earlier. This time she entered as the well-dressed companion of Louis Villers, now head of the family. Witnesses said her arrival brought the entire room to a halt. A society column described her wearing a deep blue gown that highlighted her striking appearance. Several attendees recognized her from the auction years earlier, though no one dared mention out loud. No one knows the exact agreement between Ella Lenina and Louis. Some believe he quietly purchased her freedom. Others think she found evidence about her father and used it to negotiate with him. Whatever the truth was, their appearance together crossed major social lines in New Orleans, no matter how people classified her heritage. Charles Delacroix was also at the ball. Witnesses said he looked shaken when he saw her with Louis and tried to approach them before his friends held him back. He left soon after. 3 days later, He filed a complaint claiming Lewis had taken property belonging to the Delacqua estate. The complaint was withdrawn the next day. On February 12, 1842, Ellalinina and Lewis were seen boarding a ship to France, traveling as Mr. Louis Villars and Ward. They left behind a city filled with rumors. Neither returned to the United States. 2 weeks after their departure, strange events unfolded at the Delacqua home. On February 27th, neighbors noticed unusual activity. Lights stayed on all night, and servants carried large trunks to carriages. By morning, the house was empty. Clothes hung in closets, books remained on shelves, and food sat in the pantry, as though the family planned to come back. But they never did. Charles, his wife Isabel, and their 3 children had disappeared. At first, people assumed they had fled debts. But that theory changed when, in March 1842, the bodies of 2 men were found in nearby wetlands. They were identified as Delacqua's private secretary and the plantation manager from Bow Refuge. Each had been killed by a single gunshot. Police opened an investigation, but little progress was made. The lead detective noted that everyone involved seemed unwilling to talk and hinted that something larger was at play. The investigation was suspended that summer. For more than 100 years, the disappearance of the Delacqua family remained one of New Orleans' most persistent mysteries. It resurfaced now and then in newspapers or local stories, but never with any resolution. That changed in 1962, when workers restoring the abandoned Delacqua mansion found a hidden room containing the journal, the finger bones, and the portrait. While the journal explained her confinement, it said nothing about her return in 1842. The finger bones, examined in 1964, belonged to a man who had died about 120 years earlier. Later DNA testing could not produce clear results because of the bone's condition. The portrait, however, offered a major clue. It showed Ellalinina in a blue gown, possibly the same one described at the ball. X-ray analysis in 1975 revealed an earlier painting beneath it, a family portrait of a man, woman, and young child. Art experts matched the figures to Jean-Baptiste Villars, his wife, and their infant daughter. This strongly supported the idea that Ellalinina was her child and had a valid claim to the Villars fortune. Why this important painting stayed hidden in the Delacqua house rather than leaving with her remains unclear. A partial explanation surfaced in 1982 when letters from the Villars family archives were discovered. The letters, exchanged between Louis Villars and an unnamed contact in Paris, suggested a more complex situation than anyone had imagined. In one letter from December 1841, Louis wrote that he had spoken with Ellalinina, explained how their interests aligned, and reached an understanding with her. He said she was cautious but willing to cooperate. He also mentioned that Delacqua was the main obstacle because his financial ties to Henri Villars made him fearful of any agreement that might reveal past dealings. In a letter from January 1842, Louis wrote that his attorney had confirmed certain documents were genuine and carried major legal weight. If they had surfaced during the inheritance case, the result would have been entirely different. Instead, he wrote that their current arrangement allowed Ellalinina to gain her freedom and a fair settlement, while the family avoided scandal and financial upheaval. Only Delacqua refused to accept the situation, though Louis believed his financial problems would eventually force him to do so. The letters Louis Villars exchanged suggested that it found proof that Ellalinina had a legitimate right to the Villars inheritance. Instead of taking the matter to court, he seemed to offer her a private agreement that likely included her freedom, financial support, and a promise to keep the entire situation out of public view. This would have protected the family's reputation, while giving Ellalinina what she wanted most, which was the ability to live freely. But Charles Delacqua, who had spent a large sum to buy her and may have known about certain financial issues tied to Henri Villars, was not included in the arrangement. The letters hinted that he posed a threat to keeping everything quiet, either because he knew too much or because he might try to claim legal rights over her. The final letter in the collection, written in February 1842 shortly before the Delacqua family vanished, contained only a short message. The problem has resolved itself in a most unexpected manner. I believe no further action will be required. We sail on the 12th. No one knows for certain what happened during those early days of February 1842, but historians have pieced together a likely series of events. When Charles saw Ella Lenina at the Mardi Gras ball with Louis, he realized that the person he considered his property had escaped and had formed an alliance with the new head of the Villers family. Facing financial pressure and fearing damage to his reputation, he may have tried to blackmail Louis by threatening to expose their private agreement. With Ella Lenina and Louis preparing to leave for France, they would have had strong reasons to prevent Delacroix from interfering. Their departure on February 12th and the disappearance of the Delacroix family, just over 2 weeks later, appeared closely connected. The secretary and plantation manager, who later turned up dead, may have witnessed something they were not meant to see. The finger bones found in the hidden room years later also suggested that the family's story ended violently. In 1968, newly uncovered French police records provided further clues. A report from May 1842 noted that Louis Villers and E. Reynolds had arrived in Paris and settled in an upscale neighborhood using funds drawn from the Villers estate. They lived quietly in France for several years before moving to England in 1847. Census records from 1851 show Louis and Eleanor Villers living in London, listed as husband and wife, with 2 children. They remained in England until at least 1861, after which they disappeared from public records. The Delacroix family was never found. Their home on Royal Street stood empty for decades and gained a local reputation as one of the most haunted houses in the city. People claim that during carnival season, sounds of a struggle and a woman's distant laugh could be heard from the empty building. Ella Lenina's story became a rare example of how the harsh economics of slavery collided with Louisiana's complex inheritance laws. The events that followed expose how deeply race, ancestry, and social standing shape people's lives. Today, her portrait hangs in the historic New Orleans collection, a quiet reminder of someone who fought to reclaim her identity despite the forces working against her. Her journal now serves as a valuable record for historians studying the lived experiences of people trapped in the system of slavery. The museum's catalog entry for her portrait contains a simple tribute, a woman who managed, through extraordinary circumstances, to reclaim her freedom in a society that left little room for someone in her position. What remains unclear is the full cost of that journey. Another discovery came in 1969 during further renovations of the Delacroix mansion. Under the floorboards of the hidden room, workers found a small space holding a gold locket painted with an image of a ship. The back was engraved with the initials JV and MR, dated February 20th, 1816, 9 months before Ella Lenina was born. The locket, like Ella Lenina herself, had crossed boundaries between slavery and freedom, between accepted society and those pushed to the margins. It now sits beside her portrait in the museum. The hidden room is now part of the property's historic tour. Guides tell the story of the young woman sold at the St. Louis Hotel, her connection to the Villers family, and her escape to Europe. What no one can say for certain is what happened to those who tried to prevent her from leaving. As with many dark chapters in American history, some truths remain out of reach. In 1958, long before Ella Lenina's journal was found, an elderly woman named Margaret Wilson arrived in New Orleans, claiming to be her great-granddaughter. She brought a set of letters said to be written by Ella Lenina from London between 1852 and 1868. The letters described her marriage to Louis in France, where their union was legal, and the 3 children they raised who never learned the truth about their mother's past. One letter from 1867 mentioned the Delacroix family, noting that Ella Lenina was haunted by what Louis felt forced to arrange before they fled New Orleans. She believed the Delacroix children had been sent away first, though she never knew for sure. Wilson submitted the letters to the Louisiana Historical Society, but she died suddenly before they were examined. The letters vanished during an office renovation and were never found. In 1976, historian Thomas Lawrence discovered shipping records from 1842 showing 3 children traveling from New Orleans to Havana under the surname Reynolds, accompanied by Martha Bernard, the same woman from Ella Lenina's journal. Cuban records revealed nothing more. Then, in 1981, a drought exposed an old flatboat near the former Bow Refuge site. Inside were the remains of 4 adults, each killed by a gunshot and weighted with chains. Items found with the bodies, including a watch engraved CD and a locket showing 3 children, suggested these were members of the Delacroix household. The final major clue surfaced in 1994. A hidden compartment in the Villers estate revealed a pouch containing a confession signed by Louis Villers, dated 2 days before the Delacroix disappearance. He wrote that the killings were necessary to protect Ella and Nina and that their bodies would never be found. He also confirmed the Delacroix children had been sent to Cuba under Martha's care. Ella and Nina later lived in London, where she died at 55. DNA tests in 2002 linked the finger bones in the hidden room to Charles Delacroix, tying his fate directly to the event she escaped. Her descendants blended into English society, never knowing her full story. Today, her portrait and locket remain on display in New Orleans, reminders of a woman who reclaimed her identity in a world determined to take it from her.